Very good evening to all of you. I, Vinti Kathuria, would like to welcome you all in our very first virtual session of the Right Circle in Agra. The Right Circle is an initiative of Prabha Khaitan Foundation in association with ITC Mughal and Ehsaas Women of Agra. The Right Circle is a series of informal conversations with acclaimed authors, bringing readers close to their lives and work. Prabha Khaitan Foundation is a social non-government organization, and its activities are aimed towards the betterment in the arena of education, culture, art, and women empowerment. The foundation has its presence not only pan-India, but also countries overseas. Ehsaas is an initiative of Prabha Khaitan Foundation. It is a conglomeration of women from all walks of life who contribute in their own way and inspire others for the betterment of society. We are indeed privileged to have amongst us virtually Dr. Vikram Sampath, who will be sharing the inspiration behind his work today. Born and raised in Bangalore, Dr. Vikram Sampath is a best-selling author of 3 acclaimed books, Splendors of Royal Mysore, The Untold Story of the Vodiyas, tracing the 600-year-long history of Mysore, its royal family and culture. My Name is Gohar Jan, The Life and Times of a Musician, the biography of India's first recording superstar Gohar Jan of Calcutta, and Voice of the Veena S. Palachandra, a biography, the story of eminent Veena maestro, late Dr. S. Palachandra. Dr. Vikram was awarded the Sahitya Academy's first Yuva Puraskar in English Literature in 2012 and the ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York in 2011 for his book on Gohar Jan. He's an engineer, mathematician from BITS Pilani, an MBA from SPJ in Mumbai, and a PhD in history and music from the University of Queensland. In conversation with Dr. Sampath, we have Shweta Bansal, our very own Ehsaas Women of Agra, who's an entrepreneur and an avid reader and the founder member of Literary Society in Agra called Lit Agra, which promotes art, culture, theatre in our city of Taj. Over to you, Shweta.
A very warm welcome once again, Vikram.
Thank you, Shweta.
I feel honor and privileged that I'm here in conversation with you.
Thank you.
So
I'd just like to add to the introduction that it was not 3 books but 4 books because the latest book is the biography of Veer Savarkar, which is what I think the Prabha Khaitan Foundation actively, collaborated in terms of launches in different cities in India.
Yes, so sorry for that.
That's okay.
Yeah, so Vikram, from being an engineer to a historian, from an MBA to a trained Carnatic vocalist, from being the founder, director of Bangalore Literature Festival to working in the corporate world, well, you're a man who wears many hats. So how did writing happen? When did you decide to become an author, and that to a biographer?
Yeah, I know. I think it's probably a lot of confusion also in the middle of so many hats that I seemingly supposedly wear. But then I think writing was I always defined my writing career as being, serendipitous because I'd never, planned or decided that I'd grow up to be a writer. I was probably a boy of 12 or 13, and that was when I'm sure some of you might remember there was this serial on television on Doordarshan those days called The Sword of Tipu Sultan, which Sanjay Khan used to produce and direct. In that, if you remember, there was the Mysore royal family, which was shown in a very, very poor light, just to kind of, amplify the role of Tipu, whose father Hyder Ali had actually usurped the kingdom from the Hindu Maharajas of Mysore, the Wadiyars, who, as the introduction mentioned, ruled the state for 600 years. The Maharaja and the Maharani was shown, the Maharaja was shown like this obese retard who was dancing along with the court dancer, and the Maharani was this typical, vamp from an Ekta Kapoor serial who was all the time conspiring to kind of throw Tipu out of the throne. So, and there were protests in different parts of, Karnataka and Bangalore because, even 70 years after independence, the royal family is held in a lot of regard and reverence here because of a lot of good work that the royal family had done. In fact, Mysore state was hailed as a model state and as Ram Rajya by none other than Mahatma Gandhi, who had wondered whether a province like Mysore even needed freedom. So, even recently, a couple of years back, when the last scion of the family passed away, the whole city the Mysore town just closed down voluntarily as a matter of their respect and reverence. So there were protests in different parts of this place, and I was this boy who actually, truth be told, hated history in school because of the way it is taught. And almost every history class meant kneeling outside because I really didn't know whether Jahangir came before or Shah Jahan, and which war who won, and all the rote learning that we are forced to go through. But then there was something that just clicked, saying I really need to know the truth behind this falsehood, and it almost became like a family project. Every vacation meant going to Mysore along with my parents, my maternal grandmother, who I didn't even know to read Kannada those days, and so my grandmother would help translate some of these documents, meeting people of the royal family members, going to archives there, libraries, interviews, and I was also quite fairly okay at sketching and painting and drawing. So I'd sit in the palace and make portraits of all these kings, and never with the intention of, that this is going to become a book someday. And this junoon, it was almost an obsession that carried on for 10 long years, even as I continued with my engineering and MBA and all the other things. So going to Mysore, doing this, and then the interest then expanded to the entire family from that one king and queen. And then I realized that like a lot of our history, the way it's written in this country, large parts of the country don't even get covered, particularly the south of India, the northeast of India. Our history is so very Delhi centric. Right? I mean, it's so all the dynasties who ruled Delhi, nothing wrong with it, unless you also give an equal coverage to other parts of India. And so here was one of India's longest reigning royal houses, which had so many firsts and achievements to its credit, and to not have a single book covering their history for a modern, young man and woman in India to read today, I thought that was a real sad state of affairs. And so with all this material that had been gathered over so many years, I thought, why not put this all together in the form of a book? And so way back in 2008, even as I was juggling a corporate career, I was working with the most dreaded, Citibank, which Citi never sleeps. It doesn't allow its employees to sleep either. So in the midst of all of that, it was putting this whole thing together. And it was really a dream come true of almost a decade of work, not only of me, but I think my parents, my grandmother and everyone, when that book Splendors of Royal Mysore came about. So that's why I said serendipity rules this whole journey, and that same serendipity continued even to the next book, if that's your next question.
So that's very interesting. Actually, usually you don't hear such stories of how an author usually grows, but your story is a very interesting journey, very, very interesting journey.
Thank you.
So, usually when you are primarily a biographer, so when a biographer chooses to narrate the story of a subject, you have a conviction about that person, and then you follow it up with in-depth research. So during your research, tell us one incident or some information that you gathered which went against your earlier conviction about the subject, about the person you were writing about.
So, that's a very interesting question, because I usually term a biography to be akin to a love affair. You are enchanted by a character, and then you set out on this journey, and just as it probably happens in a love affair, you start chasing the object of your love. You stalk him or her, not on social media here, but I think rummaging, because most often a biographer also realizes that the object of their desire is either either dead or in a relatively unwooable sort of a condition in life. So you're rummaging through their letters, through archival material, and then many times, again, like a love affair, the interest can break because you may decide midway, as material starts showing itself up to you, that this is probably not worth your time and effort. But if that phase doesn't happen, then the journey continues. And most importantly, I feel in a biography, it's you become so obsessed and so consumed by this character and for such a long period of time. But then if that fascination and this hero worship kind of a thing continues even at the stage of writing, then there's a very thin line between a biography and a hagiography, because and you tend you know your biographer's friends and become your friends, their enemies become your enemies, you become so possessive and defensive about their stands in life. But then if you start doing that and becoming a lawyer, a defendant of everything that they did and kind of whitewash their faults and so on, then I think that doesn't make for a good and an honest objective biography. So at the stage of documentation, this cutting off of cord, the emotional cord with it's a most difficult thing, considering you've invested so much of yourself, and at that stage to just cut off and become this neutral bystander who's then just looking at the subject as somebody else and narrating it, that is the biggest challenge I feel for an honest biographer. And in fact, that's perhaps why Virginia Woolf, right, in 1931, she's written a very seminal essay called The Art of Biography Writing, and she calls it the most restrictive of all arts, because it brings with it so many restrictions, this paucity of information and all of that. So to your question, among these people that I have written, the three people, Gauhar Jan, S. Balachandar, and more recently Veer Savarkar, the more contentious figure in Indian history, I don't think there's anything that about them. If there was something about them that I hadn't liked, I don't think I would have invested my time in pursuing their lives at all. But I think in the process, I must admit, there were several other characters, including living, people who had reached out saying, I'd like my biography to be written. A few interviews with them, and I lost interest. And so then the project itself collapses. It doesn't get to the stage of writing at all, in my view. So you can't have the project on hand and also be disillusioned with the person whom you're writing with. And I don't know, I almost always say that with every biography, I think a part of the biographer also dies, because you have led an entire life yourself. You've gone through the ups and downs, the journey of another life, and it can be deeply, deeply, emotionally draining as well. And it's after the work is over, it is like, again, to bring the love affair analogy, it's a heartbreak. So you don't know what to obsess yourself with till the time you become promiscuous and find the next object of your. Sorry for so many love analogies, all of you.
No, I love your sense of humor and these tidbits here and there, which, like, usually historians are very serious people, and biographers probably because they've read so many good, bad stories about, so they are serious people. So I love your sense of humor. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
So coming to your second book, it's quite a coincidence that when your second book, My Name is Gauhar Jan, was launched, at the same time, My Name is Khan was released. So I'm sure you weren't inspired by the name My Name is Khan to name your book.
No.
But what was it that inspired you to name your book My Name is Gauhar Jan?
Yeah. So in fact, a lot of the press did ask me the same question, whether I was piggybacking on Dharma's marketing tagline or whatever. But no. So Gauhar, as was mentioned, she was India's first commercially recorded artist, who recorded on the shellac discs, the 78 RPM gramophone discs, way back in 1902, which was when recording technology came to India from England. And if you actually hear the recordings of that time and her music in particular, at the end of it, in a very high-pitched voice, she screams out, "My name is Gauhar Jan," and there was a reason for that as well, because though the recordings were made in India, so the master shellac would be recorded in different cities in India, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, and all, and they would then be shipped to Germany, which was where in Hanover in Germany the manufacture of these records would be done. So for the technician there, this was an anonymous voice. So he would listen to the entire recording, identify the singer by this announcement, and then multiple copies would be stamped and the labels would be put and sent back. So this woman was so flamboyant in many things. She's, I'm superstar. You have liked my song, and all kinds of things in the time that was available. She managed to do all of that. You must remember that this technology, when it came to India, it was what was known as acoustic technology, acoustic recording, or it was not electrical. There were no microphones. So the singers usually had to crane their heads into a kind of a big horn and scream into that as loudly as they could. And depending on how loudly they screamed, there used to be a stylus on the other end which would vibrate and cut the etches on a shellac disc. Now, as you know, many of our classical musicians, when they sing, they get so carried away by the rag and all of that, they start moving their hands and heads. Now, that would spoil the quality of the acoustic energy that was being directed. So there would be two agents who would hold your hand, someone would hold your head and push you into that and ask you to bellow hard. So that's why most of these recordings, including hers, are very, very high pitched, much more than the normal pitch in which a musician would sing. And the other limitation was these were all only of a time duration of 3 minutes. Now, in those of the audience who know, I mean, Indian classical music is so vast and improvisatory that it can go on and on for several hours, rag vistar and alap and all of that. So for something like that, to almost like Presi writing in literature, to bring it into 3 minutes capsule and show the essence of the khayal or the thumri or the dadra or whatever, and also entertain the audience and to sell these records, I think it was a huge Herculean task. And that is one reason, again, and we're talking about this with Ehsaas, it becomes more pertinent that when recording technology came to India, it was all of you women who actually embraced this technology first and not the men folk.
I guess men were more superstitious about recording their voice, and it was mainly the women. And actually Gauhar Jaan was the first one to record her voice. True. Were there other women also like that?
Oh, lots of them, including from Agra, Zohrabai Agrewali and Malka Jaan of Agra. There was Janki Bai of Allahabad, Noti Binodini from Calcutta, and several others from Calcutta. So almost close to 400 to 500 women who recorded in the first, decade of recording in India. And the men folk usually stayed away because they suspected that they would lose their voice if they recorded, and the god would be displeased and all of that. And also, I mean, the Gharanedar Ustads felt that this was a dilution of classicism, and some women later also, much later, even someone like a Kesarbai Kerkar, who would say later that my music cannot be heard at a chai ki dukan and over an adda. It has to be highbrow art, and so it can't be dumbed down, so to say, to this extent. So there were some who stayed away, but then majority of them, north, south, east, west, they were women who recorded, and most of them belonged to the courtesan community of Tawaiffs and Devdasis. And in the south you have women like Bangalore Nagaratnamma, Salem Godavari, Dhanapoti of Kanchipuram, Coimbatore Thai, all these people who fascinating lives, fascinating stories, all of which have sadly been rubbished away to the dustbins of history. Because in the 1930s you had this huge campaign called the Anti-Notch campaign, which relegated all women who were in the performing space to be mere prostitutes, and the entire system came crashing down, and most of them were prohibited from performance. And so some of them rehabilitated themselves by moving to the film industry in Bombay and so on, but most of them died in penury, though of course Gauhar was dead by then. So my whole reference to her was again linked to the Mysore book, because I was researching on the earlier Wadeyar book, and by chance, in the palace archives, there was this box file about the visiting musicians who came to the Maharaja's court. And in that, there was one little piece about this lady. And she spent the last 2 years of her life in Mysore as a state guest of the Maharaja, and died in Mysore, in fact, in 1930, and very lonely, forlorn, with none by her bedside to shed any tears for her. And there were all these letters to the Maharaja where she was saying, please increase my income tax, please, please increase my salary, don't cut the income tax and all of that. So, and in typical official Babudam, it was said rejected, and so on. So I really felt it was a very sad story. And it also very briefly said she was the first gramophone superstar, an Armenian Christian, who was born in Azamgarh and then moved to Banaras and converted to Islam with her mother, and became a Tawaif with her, went to Wajid Ali Shah's court and became a court, performers there, mother and daughter. So someone so fascinating, and who was like the country's first page 3 rock star, a total diva, who went around town in her 6-horse driven buggy in Calcutta, for which she paid a fine of 1,000 rupees to the viceroy a day, because normal Indians were not allowed to go on these joyrides, who used to throw parties when her cat gave birth to kittens and things like that. But then again, like the usual, narrative of Tawaif's life, fell in love with all the wrong men, and then they embezzled her funds, and she was reduced to the state of beggary, where she came to Mysore, and that's where she died. So, literally chasing her from the place of her death through the length and breadth of India and also outside India. It was almost like finding a needle, in a haystack, because Tawaif, no lineage, no, students, nothing. But I don't know what impulse drove me into this
an arduous task, I'm sure. It must have been such a challenge, and you took up the challenge to write her biography and work so hard on it. And I'm sure it paid off well when it was adapted as a play and directed by Lilith Dubey. And now I think the movie rights have been bought by Ashutosh Gowarikar.
That's right.
How do you feel? I mean, I'm sure you must be feeling very proud about the fact, about all the hard work that you went through.
To be very honest, I just feel I'm an instrument in this journey, at least with Gohar Jan, because somewhere she was overseeing this whole project, and I was just, she probably just found me sitting in that archive and said, "Acha, bakra mil gaya, isko pakad lete hain." So it was so most of the thing, I know, one, like I said, the journey was so indeterminate. And so from Azamgarh to Banaras, Rampur, Darbhanga, Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, London, Berlin, I don't know, I must have gone to so many different places searching for her. And each one led to the other so miraculously. I can write, in fact, a book only on that whole journey of how people just turned up by themselves, so to say, with so many things, and with too many experiences of that kind. And and this book actually changed my life. So it was after this book, which also brought me all the acclaim in terms of the awards it brought me. It also made me, dump my corporate career for good and take up writing as a full-time career option. It also helped me set up the Archive of Indian Music, India's first digital sound archive for gramophone records. And when Lilith approached me and she said she wanted to do this play, it was a wonderful experience to also see not only Gohar Jan, but also your work being translated from one medium to the other. And Rajeshwari has played the part of Gohar so beautifully in that. And Mahesh Dattani and I worked on the script for the play. And the first show was at NCPA in Mumbai, and I remember when Gohar first came and she was talking there, I actually had tears in my eyes, because it was literally seeing your muse in flesh and blood. And there was a Kathak dance or something that she was doing and swirling round and round, and she does this, and Rajeshwari also knew that my equation with that. So since I was in the first row, she almost came close and did that with a sense of thank you for resurrecting me. And so that was a very, very surreal feeling, that it was almost Gohar herself coming down and saying thank you.
You must have felt like, exactly. Yeah. It must be giving you goosebumps thinking about
it still does. And now
it's giving me goosebumps.
Now with Ashutosh, it's been a nice journey that way. I'm actually, working with him, trying our hands together at screenplay writing too, because, and so as a period consultant also for the film. So we're looking at, trying to make it, of course, Bollywood can commercialize and there can be a lot of masala that's added, but it, told him that please ensure the sensitivity, particularly, since it's a woman's story, it needs to have that kind of sensitivity to it.
Yeah, very true. So you, as a biographer, like, because you are a non-fictional writer, you don't like to, because usually to make a book interesting, it's said that the facts are usually diluted by fiction, and for an author to maintain that balance, and especially for a biographer to maintain a balance between truthful portrayal and engaging the author, it's engaging the reader, it's a very very tough task. So do you think that you need to dilute the facts with some imagination to make the reading enrich the reading experience?
I wouldn't say dilute the facts. I would say, embellish it, because, and that's the new term that's becoming, that's gaining, momentum, particularly in the whole art and craft of history writing in India, called narrative nonfiction, where nonfiction need not be just a catalog of events, which is boring and which is just dry facts staring at your face. You can also interweave it in a form of a story format. Like, for instance, in my the book on Gauhar Jaan opens with this scene where a horse carriage carrying her comes in Mysore, and it stops at this at her house, the little bungalow she's given by the Maharaja there. So I described that street. I described the flowers there, jasmine, which Mysore is so famous for. So this lady is an old lady then, so she steps out. So I'd seen her photograph at that age. So I've described a bit of the gold-rimmed glasses she wore and the walking stick she had. So how she alighted from the carriage, and then she puffed her nose with the fragrance of the jasmine and said, Allah, please make this my last resting place, because I have seen a lot in my life, and so on. So in the course of my research, I had gone to that street where that bungalow was, called Dil Khush Cottage, Dil ko khush karne wala kind of cottage. So and there are these bougainvillea, shrubs all over. It's a very nice leafy locality, and you can see the Chamundi hills from there. So a little description of that scenery. So these are all facts, but then instead of just mentioning that she stayed at number 20, the Chamundi Vihar, Mysore. I mean, that's this sort of leading the reader into it. Doesn't compromise on any of the facts, but it just makes it so much more accessible and interesting. Otherwise, most of our Indian history is going to have these, so many footnotes and so many pedantic things, which I think robs away the whole romance of writing and reading.
I like the way, you describe your character. You make it so vivid, so lively. I mean, when it's now I want to read the book now,
Wow.
after, I've started reading your latest book. Okay. I have the book. Yes. Savarkar. So we'll come to that now. Savarkar, Echoes from a Forgotten Past. I think his name has always been maligned or ignored. His work was always left neglected. And he also had a very polarizing effect. There was a group of people who would glorify him, call him like a revolutionary, a nationalist, passionate promoter of Hindutva. On the other side, there is another group which demonizes him and says that he was the proponent of the two-nation theory. He was one of the conspirators in the assassin of Gandhiji. He was also so there are controversies.
True.
So why did you want to write the biography of such a controversial person? Why Savarkar?
So again, I don't know, serendipity there, because for me, characters who are either forgotten or who are maligned, somehow they capture my attention a lot. And in fact, even Balachandra ji, on whom I wrote, he was a very amazing musician, but at the same time, he's almost like an outcast in the Madras Carnatic music firmament, because he was very, very outspoken, spoke about a lot of the evils that exist in the world of classical music, the commercialization of music. And so he's like a pariah there. Nobody even touches him with a barge pole. There's been nothing written about him. And so such characters come calling. I don't know how. So it was the same, I think, even with Savarkar. So though, I knew about him, 50% of my, background, I'm a Maharashtrian. And so Savarkar was someone about whom my maternal side always spoke about. But still, I didn't know anything because we never studied about him in our history textbooks in school. I think it was in 2003, 2004, when Vajpayee's government was in power, we had the whole controversy surrounding, firstly, when his portrait was unveiled in the Central House of Parliament, Central Hall of Parliament, and when I think the Congress objected to it, and then a plaque in his honor was put at Cellular Jail in the Kalapani in Port Blair, where he spent 12 long years in incarceration. And a year later, when the UPA came in, you had Mani Shankar Iyer, who got that plaque removed and thrown out, saying he's a traitor. And so that time itself, I was like, okay, this again seems to be something that's brewing, which is waiting
calling me.
capture. Yeah. So the interest had begun then, and I started. And his life is like a magnum opus. There's so many ups and downs, and very, very stormy life. From what you also mentioned, so many ups and lots of downs. So there was a lot of research that I had to do for that as well. Went to London, the British Library there, and the archives, then France, Germany, where there are, unlike Gauhar Jan here, there was a problem of plenty. There's like so much of material, which so few people have actually, accessed. So despite the polarizing figure that you mentioned of either, people love him or hate him, it's so sad that the last, biography of his was written way back in the 1960s, in English by this man called Dhananjay Keith, when Savarkar was still alive. He died in 1966. So between then and now, if you see, there are almost every year you have biographies of various, national leaders and political figures, Gandhiji, Nehru, and Patel, and Bhagat Singh, Subhash Chandra Bose, all of them. And history is a discipline like that, which lends itself to constant revision, re-evaluation, a re-looking at the past, and a reassessment, not only from a different perspective that we have as, modern young people, or also with new documents and archival material that comes about. So, but someone like him, whom people hated so much, even they did not manage to do the kind of research that one needs to do. And the same could be said of those who loved him and claimed to be his proponents, because nobody seemed to have read him as well. And he was himself a very, very prolific, writer in Marathi, and close to 5,000, 6,000 pages of, work, poetry, was a playwright, wrote articles in newspapers, was a very, very vociferous had very strong views. Those things needed to be accessed. And most of the historians, the Marxist historians and others who were in Delhi and other places, I think they didn't even reference some of his original Marathi work, and were still, kind of maligning him. So again, the idea was not to, resurrect him or to become his spokesperson or be, in defense of him, because I'm sure he doesn't need me for that at all. But then the idea is to bring all aspects of his life into public domain, and let the readers, discerning readers, make up their mind, as to what would their assessment be of someone like him, vis-a-vis the other contemporaries in the political scene in India at that time, and particularly with reference to the freedom struggle and how did that actually happen. Because I time and time again keep mentioning that I think the way we've been taught our history, and particularly the history of our freedom struggle, is that we have been fed a very simplistic, a very monochromatic version, of this non-violent movement of freedom struggle. That it was one after the other, many things happened, and finally the British, we politely asked them quit India, and they said okay, fine, and then they left one day. But I think there were a number of strands that were coexisting along with the main, the mainstream mass movement that Gandhiji and the Congress were leading. And these were the armed revolts in different parts of India, starting from the 1857 uprising till the naval mutiny in Bombay in 1946, which Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose led, which is actually what brought India her freedom. And that strand of our history and our freedom struggle, such an important aspect. Soon we'll be touching 75 years of freedom, and we still as a nation don't know what exactly got us our freedom. So what does that say about us, as a country and as a people, and who are all these different characters? So I thought somewhere, it's a historian's burden to ensure that these things come out in the open so that people get to know.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think no, and when you're talking about the 1857 freedom struggle, I think there were some unsung heroes like the Chapekar brothers, Vasudev, Balwant Fatke, who were actually inspirations for Veer Savarkar.
Yes, true.
And I think there were a lot of freedom fighters in the next generation after Savarkar, who Savarkar was an inspiration for them. Can you tell us who were those, and in what way did they influence Savarkar?
Yeah.
So Savarkar influenced them.
Yeah. So yeah, it was this unending stream from the kind of people you mentioned, Phadke and Chapekars and others, and even Savarkar's contemporaries. We don't even know their names now. The 5 years that Savarkar spent in London, as a student of law, you have this fascinating array of people, young men who had come in from different parts of India, probably taking loans, mortgaging their houses, middle-class families who had gone to England to study and to make a life for themselves, suddenly get, turned on by this entire cascade of, revolution and freedom for the motherland and so on. And they come to the extent of giving up their lives for the nation. Shamji Krishna Varma, Madam Bhikaji Kama, that famous, woman Bombay who goes there, and then the Parsi lady, and then and from different parts of India, and different nationality, communities within India. It was almost like a microcosm. And so Virendranath Chattopadhyay, Madan Lal Dhingra, Lala Hardayal, who later goes on to form the Gadar Party, which forms actually a transnational freedom movement between India, America, Canada, and Southeast Asia. Imagine in a time when communication was not what it is today, to be able to create this international nexus of revolutionary movement to free the country. Whether they succeeded or not, that's another issue, but at least they gave up their lives for this. But then their names don't feature at all. And Savarkar was right in the middle of this whole chain, and he was also providing the intellectual corpus for the revolutionary movement. So along with inspiring these people. So so while in London, he actually went to the British archives. He researched about the 1857 uprising, which was till then, disparagingly called as Sepoy Mutiny, because, the British wanted to just say, it was just some chotput ghatna with some sepoys doing some bagavat. But so he used the British records and he was the one who coined this word, the First War of Indian Independence, and writes this book as well, which is such a fascinating book in itself. Of course, it's a lot of flourish, it's less of history, and as a historian, I wouldn't approve because half of it doesn't have footnotes, but then a lot of poetry, the poet in him takes over several times. But then, the fact that that book becomes the first book, in fact, in the history of world literature, which is banned even before it is published, because the British got to know that this highly seditious book was being written. And so the Viceroy, nonetheless, of India, Lord Minto, wrote back to London saying, at any cost, this book should not come to India because it's going to create a lot of unrest in the country. And so the Sea Customs Act is put on it so that it's prevented from coming to the country. But then these revolutionaries have their way. So they had actually, smuggled copies of the manuscript in false bottom boxes. So there was a double barrel box. The bottom you had the manuscript, and on top they used to put some presents, Christmas presents, and Pickwick papers, all kinds of things. And that's how this would get smuggled to India. Now it's sent to Savarkar's elder brother, Baba Rao, in India. Now he tries to get it published, but then there is a chapa on the whole printing press. Then the manuscript is sent back to London. From there, they send it to Paris. Then the French police get behind the manuscript. Then that manuscript is sent to Germany. Now the Germans, they thought, because they knew Indology and the Devanagari script, because this was in Marathi, they do a good job, but they did a mess of the whole typesetting. And so the manuscript was withdrawn. Then it was sent to Belgium. And in Belgium, finally it was published. And then translation of it was done into English by his associate VVS Iyer. And this copy was then smuggled back to India. And that book, ended up becoming almost the Bible for revolutionaries 25 years afterwards. This was published in 1909, 1910. So in the 1920s, you had Bhagat Singh, who got the second edition of the book published. And in the course of my research, very accidentally, I came across an interview of this man called Durga Das Khanna, who was initially a revolutionary associate of Bhagat Singh, but later on moves over to the Congress party and becomes a Congress legislator. He says in that interview that when I was recruited by Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, and others into the HSRA, they asked me specifically, have you read Savarkar's book? Because so that was like the entry criterion for revolutionaries, because it established and explained what revolution is and how it should be done. And 20 years later, you had during the INA raids, the Indian National Army raids that was conducted, copies of the book in tatters were found even in languages like Tamil and also in Japanese, because Rash Bihari Bose and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had got this book translated into Japanese as well when Netaji went away to Tokyo. Yeah. So a book which outlived, the time of its being published and written, that itself, I think, gives such a huge contribution to the whole revolutionary struggle in India. So I think these are aspects which really we as Indians don't even know and don't even care to know, and very easily, we sit in our air-conditioned rooms and pass judgments and say, okay, this person was a traitor and that person was a patriot, without knowing the whole context of what exactly they entailed in their lives.
Very true. And I was it this book because of which he was deported back to India and sent and said that he's a traitor, that he was anti-British and he's trying to create something against the king and send back to India and send to cellular jail? Was it this book?
This book was also one of the reasons, but then he was also doing some other interesting things, which was, sending his associates to other cities in Europe to smuggle bomb manuals. These bomb, so it was, and the nexus that people were having from Maharashtra. So he formed actually India's first organized secret society, called in India, in Nashik, and then in Pune called the Mitra Mela, which later became Abhinav Bharat. And so the members of the Abhinav Bharat and also those in Bengal, the Anushilan Samiti and all of these, they were actually working in tandem. So the whole idea was to create an uprising in the Indian army, very similar to 1857, and how to work in coordination. Simultaneously, there's an uprising in different parts of India. So in London, when he goes there, also he has a chapter of that in London. And so there are people. So from Maharashtra, you had Senapati Bapat, and from Bengal, you had this man called Hemchandra Das Kanungo. They go to Savarkar and he sends them on a mission to Russia to get this copy of this bomb manual, which they find actually with a tailor there. And that man gives him the document. Now, Hemchandra was a great photographer, so he takes pictures of all of this, some 50 photographs, but it's all in Russian. And they say, we don't know how to read this thing, Kala Akshar Bhains Barabar. So then so happens that Senapati Bapat had a girlfriend in Germany who was studying MBBS. And so she was a Russian lady. And so she said, I will translate it. So that was translated in 6 months that she took. And then that was translated into English, cyclo-styled, and copies came to India. In the same false bottom boxes, along with also bombs and pistols. So, and these pistols and Browning pistols were used in political assassinations in India. In the Alipur bomb case, where Khudiram Bose and Prafulla Chaki, Aurobindo Ghosh and Barin Ghosh, his brother, all of these were implicated. And also in the Nashik murder case, where Anant Lakshman Kanhere, one of the Abhinav Bharat members, actually killed the British district collector there. So then the British got alarmed, saying something is happening. And then they saw the same bomb manual in the same copy actually in different parts of India. And they said, oh my God, it's a common source that, it's leading to this. And then when they traced and investigated, and Savarkar and the India House that he lived in was constantly under the surveillance of Scotland Yard. and all the detectives were there. So they traced it back to him. And so the British actually in their records, they call him a D category or a dangerous category criminal. And so he was extradited, and at any cost, the British didn't want him to even be in mainland India. And so they had to be, he had to be sent far, far away to Kalapani for the longest kind of and harshest punishment probably anyone has got, which is 2 transportations for life, 25 plus 25, 50 long years. And all his degrees were snatched away from him, including the law degree, his bachelor's degree from Ferguson College. And he was probably a young man of 27, 28. So by the time he was 77, in 1960 was when he would be released from Kalapani. So that was the kind of punishment that he was meted out to him. But even then, when the judge apparently, gave this thing that there are going to be 2 life imprisonments for you, everybody was looking at him, and the eyewitnesses said he got up and said, "Thank you, Your Honor, finally for accepting the Hindu, belief of reincarnation, because I can have 2 transportations only if I have another life. So, there can be 2 lives and 2 life imprisonment. So finally, you people have agreed to that. So, I mean, the equanimity of mind is quite something to have." Yeah.
So coming to Sri Aurobindo and Veer Savarkar, they had things which were very similar. They were both firebrand revolutionaries. They were both, they believed in violence to bring down the British rule. And they were, of course, both sent to jail, though he was not convicted for the, Sri Aurobindo was not convicted, though imprisoned, but Savarkar was sent to cellular jail. But there was some metamorphosis which happened between, there was some metamorphosis that happened and which changed them, from being hardcore revolutionaries, they became preachers of Hinduism. But still there was some difference between the Hinduism in which both of them believed. Can you throw some light on the Hindutva of Savarkar and Hinduism of Hindutva, Veer Savarkar and Hinduism of Sri Aurobindo?
Wow, that's a fascinating question, I must say. First time someone's asked me to bring this kind of a link between the two. So, I mean, the Hindutva that Savarkar propounded in 1923, sitting in jail, a thin booklet, of about 80-90 pages, and it was written in English, while all his other works were in Marathi, clearly with the idea that this was for a pan-Indian audience. So while he was in jail, I think that changed him to a large extent, where he saw that, with the usual British divide and rule policy, they had kept Muslim Jamadars from the northwest frontier province, these Pathans, brawny Pathans who were kept to guard all these Hindu prisoners. And the treatment that the prisoners got there was terrible, to say the least. I mean, inhuman, even the basic human facilities of good food and toilet and all of that not being given to all of them. And most of them went senile or committed suicide because death was better than life there. So that time these Jamadars would say, convert to Islam and then we will reduce your suffering and your punishment. And people would say, okay, just to get rid of this, it doesn't matter you say Ram or Allah, if you're having a better time there, it's okay. But then when they had to get back to their religion, there was no process of reconversion or so in Hinduism, being a non-proselytizing religion. So he starts this whole Shuddhi movement inspired by the Arya Samaj and Dayanand Saraswati, and starts to reclaim people back into the fold. But more importantly, I think what was happening at that time was the whole Khilafat agitation that Mahatma Gandhi had launched, which was, in my view, and I've written it in very, very unceremonious terms only in my book also, of a very dangerous attempt of bringing religion into politics. And it kind of sowed the seeds of partition of the country. Because what was the Khilafat movement was that you were actually communally inspiring a group of people, in this case the Muslims of India, saying you participate in the freedom struggle on the condition that we will help you in your religious belief that the caliphate in Turkey is so important for you that we will help you re-establish the Sultan or the Caliph who had lost his power after the First World War. So and then Gandhi promised both Swaraj as well as the Khilafat being re-established in 1 year, and that never happened. And so the backlash of that was communal riots and carnages across India. The Mopla carnage in Malabar, in Kerala, where broad daylight, Hindus were butchered, men, women, children. There were other parts of India which were struck with riots. And Gandhi's response to that, and the Congress's response, was, pusillanimous to say the least. And there needed to be some kind of intellectual response, from somebody from the Hindu community, and that's precisely what Savarkar did. So in his Hindutva book, he says the word Hindutva has nothing to do with the theological construct of Hinduism or the religion, and he himself was an atheist, and a non-ritualistic kind of a person. So he used this more as a cultural and a nationalistic identity marker, saying anybody who lives within the Indus and the seas, who considers this landmass, this sacred geography, as the land of his or her ancestors, and also as a holy land, not in terms of religious holy land, but in terms of reverence, in terms of loyalty, and not having that extraterritorial, association of my loyalty lies with the Caliph of Turkey, and so you'd rather work for the liberation of your motherland than work somewhere else. So that sort of a person would be called a Hindu. And that is the Hindutva, the essence of Hindutva. So in fact, he says, people like Annie Besant and Sister Nivedita and all these people, he says it was not their Pitrubhu or the land of their ancestors, but then they have probably contributed to this country much more than what Indians themselves have done. And so they would be considered as Hindus. So it's not
so
the
they call
religion.
it the Punya Bhumi or
Punya Bhumi and Pitrubhumi. Yeah.
Pitrubhumi, yeah.
So to that extent, it was actually the way it was conceived of initially. It was a very inclusive, where he said we're all of the same caste. Of the same blood and the same DNA. So whether you're a Brahmin or a Nair or a Shudra or a tribal community in the Andamans, we all have the same, the blood that flowed from Rama to Krishna to Guru Nanak to Shivaji. So all this kind of very poetic flourish. So what is the harm in intercaste marriage, intercaste dining, all of that. So in fact, 13 years in Ratnagiri where he was kept, that becomes a crucible also for social reforms that he did for a casteless society. Establishing India's first temple ever in 1931 called the Patit Pavan Mandir, where people of all communities could enter. The priest was actually someone from the Bhangi or the scavenger community, the lowest in the order in Maharashtra. And there was the first intercaste dining cafe that was set up there too, where people of all castes could sit together and eat, which even today it may be a difficulty in different parts of India.
Absolutely, would agree.
So and we're talking of the 1930s. So
30s,
so it was a huge step that he took. So that was his whole idea of Hindutva, which he put into practice. Now Sri Aurobindo is a vastly different, where I think from Hinduism, maybe he navigated more towards the spiritual aspects of religion beyond rituals, where he the kind of treatises that he wrote on the Gita, on the Upanishads, and so on, and looking again at the consciousness of the human being. But somewhere they were both also united by this whole patriotic sentiment of the Rashtra Purush, or the national consciousness that needed to rise. And so coincidentally, we won our independence on Sri Aurobindo's birthday, which was 15th of August.
I'm sorry, I'll have to intervene. Can we have the Q&A session now?
Absolutely. I think we should, we have lots of questions to go on, I think, Vikram, but we have to stop here.
Sure.
But you have done a commendable job.
Thank you so much.
And brought to light these unsung heroes and heroines whose lives were actually covered with dust of history. You've done a commendable job. Thank you so much for giving this to us, to our country, to our children. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was lovely talking to you. And I think the way you brought out so many different aspects, I think it was truly commendable. Thank you.
No, I love the way you answered, and your sense of humor is superb. truly fantastic. Really enjoyed every bit of the conversation. Thank you so much. So now we have an open house. And Vikram, I think you'll be flooded with questions. So I'll hand over to Apra now.
The first question is by Mr. Mohit Mahajan. Mr. Mohit Mahajan, please ask your question.
Hello, Mr. Vikram.
Hello, Mohit.
My second question is a second contrast with another, this time Gandhiji. Gandhiji was a devout Hindu, whereas Veer Savarkar was a rationalist Hindu. Gandhiji, of course, did cow worship. Whereas Veer Savarkar was against all superstition. One was a practicing Hindu, the other was a Hindu atheist. Yet when it came to the question of safety and security and well-being of Hindus, Gandhiji always advocated Hindus sacrifice themselves because he said that this was the correct moral way. Veer was, on the other hand, was very clear. Time had come for Hindus to stop being passive, accept compromises in the name of false morality. Like you said, he had defined Hindutva and rather Hinduism as as those people who considered India as Pitrubhumi as well as their Punya Bhumi. And maybe he said it was time for Hindus to assert their rights and stop being second-class citizens, which they were for the last so many hundreds of years. And now what we see is that Gandhiji was a father of nation. Maybe this is a political question, but would a nation state of assertive Hindus be better than a nation state of moral Hindus?
That's a great question. So I don't know where to start. And
I mean, it's a political question, I know. And
I'm perfectly fine, taking political questions as well. When you write a biography of a politician, then you can't shy away from political questions.
Exactly. This is
there's this entire book, which now I'm in the process of writing the volume 2 of Savarkar's biography, which takes the story ahead from 1924 to the end of his life. And he was the president of the All India Hindu Mahasabha. And in the 5 years that he was there, the Hindu Rashtra Darshan, the compilation of all his speeches as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, I think that sets the ground very clearly about what his conception was of this behemoth that we create of Hindu Rashtra. It's going to come and gobble up all the minorities and everything. So in that, he very clearly asserts, I think repeatedly 1937 onwards, that in his conception of a Hindu Rashtra, there's going to be no distinction made between people on the basis of religion, caste, creed, even gender, and everybody is going to be equal in the eyes of the law. So a Hindu is not going to get extra privileges by virtue of being the majority community, and similarly nobody is going to get extra concessions on the basis of being a minority. And also, he said if the government and the minorities need not have, in his own words, not even a ghost of suspicion. That was the phrase that that their cultural, religious, or even linguistic rights will be trampled upon. And if in case somebody does that, then the state would intervene to ensure that that is removed. And if the state wants to support, say, giving funds to madrasas or churches or whatever, they can go ahead and do it. But the amount of money that needs to go from the state exchequer should be proportionate to the amount of tax the community pays to the national exchequer. So how much ever you are contributing to national development, you will get in return to that. But then you can all live as equal citizens. So in fact, when time and time again, now also it happens, but even in his life, when he was compared to Jinnah and said, you are the mirror opposite of Jinnah, and you are the proponent of the two-nation theory, he time and time again says that Jinnah and I are polar opposites, because he asks for extra concessions, whereas I'm asking for equality for everybody. So I think when we say assertive Hindus vis-a-vis a moral Hindu, assertiveness in this aspect of saying, yes, it is by and large, when you talk of the culture of this country, it has an indelible Hindu mark of which you don't have to be embarrassed of or ashamed of, or you don't have to disown that. And at the same time, it's not going to be, trampling on the rights and the the cultural identities of other groups within this country. So this coexistent living, along with that confidence that you're not going to give away a lot of your own just to kind of accommodate someone, which is, I think, what sadly the secular narrative in this country has become, where religious institutions of the majority community come under government control and can be taxed, and you can have all kinds of people at the helm of affairs, whereas other institutions actually get government patronage. So which is kind of very, very counterproductive and stupid. So to that extent, I think this differentiation that is made out is really clear, and that the whole dichotomy between Gandhi and him, if I have the time, I'll just take 1 minute to say, I mean, they were polar opposites, so to say, in their conception of this. Gandhi, to my view, was a piecemeal reformer, and he knew the Indian, mindset that whereas Savarkar and even Ambedkar, I would call them as nihilists, someone who stood for a dismantling of the whole system, break down the edifice and reconstruct. So even advocating for a casteless society, untouchability, erasure completely, all of that was what Savarkar and Ambedkar were advocating. Whereas Gandhi knew that Indian society is not going to accept this sort of an earthquake. So he was doing bit by bit, patchwork on the body rubric, so to say, of the society. And so also getting very, craftily with a marketing acumen, getting religion into, whether it was Khilafat, then you have all this bhajans that were sung and all of that. So he knew religion is the opium of our masses. And so nothing better than the saintly figure, then people would naturally gravitate to that person a lot more than someone who says cow is not divine. You can cut her up and eat it up if there is nothing else to eat, and so on. So that kind of shakes up people even now. So imagine in the 1920s and 30s. So to that extent, I think he was also very rash that way, too outspoken, without understanding perhaps somewhere that Indian society takes reforms very, very slowly, step by step. And while complete change, shake-up of the system is very much necessary, whether it's accepted so much is what is the problem. And that's why Gandhi, as you said, is the father of the nation, and the other one is his alleged assassin.
Right. So just 20 more seconds. I read your the V. Savarkar biography along with Awakening Bharat Mata by Chotan Das Gupta. Mm-hmm. So what I think is that volume 3 of your this thing has already been written by Chotan Das Gupta, because it talks about Veer Savarkar's effect after Veer Savarkar passed away. That is all. That is all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice talking to you.
Thank you so very much. I'm sorry we will not be able to take any more questions now. Thank you so very much, Mr. Sampath. Over to you, Shweta and Vinti.
It was a wonderful conversation here. I would like to thank Dr. Sampath. We really appreciate you taking out time for us from your busy schedule. It's been a great pleasure to host you this evening. A special thanks to each one of you for attending our virtual session and making this evening successful. Thank you.